A very warm welcome to the new episode of Ink and Insights. This is your host, Sumit Sharma Sameer. This is a Nepal-based podcast, and if you are interested listening to the thought leaders from around the world, please subscribe to my channel. I'm extremely pleased to welcome an internationally recognized thought leader and a world-renowned pied piper for everyone and anyone who seeks to grow their business faster, Professor John Mullins, in my program today. John Mullins is a best-selling author, a veteran of 3 entrepreneurial ventures, and a professor of management practice at London Business School. He has published 4 books: The New Business Road Test, Getting to Plan B with the esteemed VC investor Randy Komisar, The Customer-Funded Business, and recently Break the Rules. All his works are go-to source on its stage of the entrepreneurial journey and are definitive works on assessing opportunities and on business models. John is a sought-after speaker to communities of entrepreneurs, to CEOs and top management teams of fast-growing companies, and to other innovators worldwide. His highly interactive and inspiring workshops on matters related to starting, financing, and growing fast-growing entrepreneurial companies have found their way to all but 2 of the world's 7 continents. No call from Oceania or the penguins in Antarctica just yet, and have thereby made an important contribution to the world's economic development. As the research clearly shows, fast-growing entrepreneurial companies, not startups, not large multinationals, are the drivers of job growth everywhere, from America to Zambia. Helping to unlock entrepreneurial potential and its financing is what John loves to do. It's a pleasure to have you on my show, John. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Sumit, and thank you for the kind words. I'll do my best to live up to them.
John, let me begin by asking what really inspired you to delve into the world of entrepreneurship and write books on this subject?
Well, I'd been an entrepreneur. I spent 20 years in the retail industry in the U.S., did 2 startups as part of that career. And when I came to be a professor, one of the things we do as professors is we do research. And I spent several years doing that as a member of a marketing department at a U.S. institution. But really, my heart was with entrepreneurs all the way. So when I earned tenure there, I had a chance to then kind of work on really what drove my passion. And one of those things was, so that was in about the very late 90s. And if you recall that period of time, it was in the heart of the dot-com boom, and there are all kinds of crazy dot-com ventures being founded, most of which quickly failed. And I said, nobody really has given entrepreneurs the tools for how do you figure out if an idea is actually any good. So maybe I ought to spend some time and see if I can figure that out. And that turned out to be my first book, The New Business Road Test. And there was never a plan to write 4 books. There's a plan to write 1 book, and I wrote 1. And then another challenge comes along, and well, maybe you need to write another one, John. And that's how it's gone.
Right. And what does it mean? What does it really mean to be an entrepreneur in present economic context, John?
Well, often people struggle with what the definition of entrepreneur is. Is an entrepreneur a risk taker? Is it somebody who works for himself or herself? Is it somebody who starts a business? I like the definition that Howard Stevenson at Harvard Business School put forth a long time ago, which is an entrepreneur is somebody who pursues an opportunity in which they believe without regard to the resources they currently have under their control. So somebody wants to do something that's going to make their corner of the world a little better place somehow, but they're not too worried that they don't have the money yet or they don't have the team around them yet. They'll find a way to get it done. That's right. What an entrepreneur is, and that's what we need in the world today. Because if we're gonna move society forward and put people to work, particularly in parts of the world where jobs are sorely needed, it's going to be entrepreneurs and their fast-growing businesses that do that, as you pointed out.
Right. Your new book, The Break the Rules, had just come out. Why did you feel that there's a need to write this particular book at this point of time?
Well, I think we've been through some tough times economically around the world in the past. They come and go, but we had the 2008 financial crisis. Then more recently, we had COVID land. And in those tough times, I think it becomes clear that it's the entrepreneurs who get through those tough times the best. They find ways to pivot, as we call it today.
Right.
They find new opportunities that those difficult times present. And it seemed to me that we need more people in organizations of all kinds to think and act entrepreneurially. And so that led to the book.
Right. And in this book, you have spoken about the 6 mindsets that run counter to what's considered best practices in large companies and fly in the face of much of what's taught in business school. So what's the different?
Well, I think all these mindsets are different. Business education has been around for a very long time, and the world has taught us who are charged with teaching and teaching the next generation what some of the best practices are. But what I find, or what I found in doing the research for the book, is that some of the things that entrepreneurs do so well actually run counter to these best practices that are found in big companies and aren't consistent with what we teach in business schools. That doesn't mean that what we're teaching and what the big companies are doing isn't the right thing to do most of the time. And indeed, generally it is. But what it means is we don't have to be bound by those as rules. We can break some of those conventional rules when the circumstance calls for it.
Right. So, and what kind of rules are you suggesting to break?
Well, for example, it's long been the case that we advise companies to stick to their knitting. You're supposed to figure out what your core competencies are. You nurture them, you build on them, you invest in them. You try and make them more robust and more defensible. And when somebody comes along and asks your company to do something that lies outside that set of core competencies, you're supposed to say, no, we don't do that. We focus on our core competencies. That's how we're going to build a successful business. But I find that entrepreneurs don't get bound by that rule. So if something comes along, if a customer asks for something new, perhaps that they haven't done before, instead of saying, no, that's not what we do, they say, well, let me think about that a little bit. And often they figure out that new thing some customer asks for is a really good idea and nobody else is offering it. And if they were to offer it, even though they haven't done it before, it might turn out to be an attractive thing. So I tell the story in the book of Arnold Correa, a Brazilian entrepreneur who's built one of the largest digital out-of-home advertising businesses in Brazil, who reinvented the business completely 3 times because he was willing to break that rule of sticking to your knitting. And he went off and did something new, and he's better off for it, and his many employees are better off for it, and I think Brazil's better off for it.
Right. The passion seems to be one of the strong component that's driving the entrepreneurs. Is it still important for the startups?
Yeah, I think passion is critically important because we learned the hard way, we learned empirically that being an entrepreneur is a really tough task. It's highly uncertain. You're typically doing something new that hasn't been done exactly the way you're doing it before. You don't know if it's going to work. You don't know if the customers are going to really respond to what you think they'll respond to. You don't know how the competitors will deal with you. So there's a ton of uncertainty. And there are going to be a lot of tough times along that path. And I think the only way you get through those tough times is if you really have passion for solving the problem that you're trying to solve. That gets you through those tough days. And
your book, The New Business Road Test, emphasizes the importance of market validation before launching a new venture. And can you elaborate on why this step is crucial?
Well, I think too often entrepreneurs think that when they come up for an idea for a new business, the first thing they should do is write a business plan. The second thing is they should go pitch that to some investors to get some money. And then the third thing is they'll be rich. Well, the reality doesn't usually work out exactly like that, First of all, most new businesses fail. We know that. Some fail sooner, some fail later, but most of them fail. And so why would you bother writing a business plan for an idea that actually is unlikely to work, at least in the form in which you initially conceive of it.
Right.
Wouldn't it make more sense to spend your time really understanding your idea, figure out if it solves a real customer problem, and if so, for which customers does it solve such a problem? And then when you figured out whether the market is right, then figure out whether the industry is right. Do I want to play in this industry? That's a different question than do I want to serve this market? And do I have what it takes to build sustainable competitive advantage over time? Otherwise, you're just doing research for somebody who'll come eat your lunch. So all of that work can be done before really planning how to pursue the opportunity. So my view is that we first ought to assess the opportunity. Maybe we decide, actually, we don't want to do this. We just figured out why we don't want to do that, or we like it, but maybe the target market's wrong, or maybe we're at the wrong place in the value chain. You learn a lot from doing that, right. And then you pivot. But why not pivot before you burn anybody's money and a bunch of your time, rather than pivoting after those things have happened? So it just makes enormous sense, and the world has seen now that it makes enormous sense.
Right. So, John, is that I see so much of innovation going on around the world. Do you still feel that there's still space for a lot of other innovations?
Oh, we'll never run out of space for innovation. there are always new and better ways to do most things.
Right.
And of course, the power of technology is making all kinds of new things possible that weren't possible before.
And in your other book, the customer-funded business, you advocate for various ways entrepreneurs can finance their ventures without relying on traditional funding sources. Can you discuss some of these alternative financing methods?
Yeah, it turns out there are 5 of them. And there's a name that I've attached to each. There's pay in advance models, where you simply ask the customer to pay something, maybe part, maybe all, in advance. And of course, that's what service businesses have done for years, right? You typically, if you want a designer to remodel your kitchen for you, you're going to pay something up front before they get to work. So it's pretty common in service businesses, but really it can be done in product businesses too, as Michael Dell showed us, right? When did his first customers pay for the computer? Well, before he bought the parts and before he assembled those parts and turned them into a computer. Pretty ingenious. So that's one. The second one is matchmaker models, where you just bring together buyers and sellers, right? But you never touch, you never own what's being bought and sold. So that's Airbnb with places to stay. It's eBay with stuff that you want to get rid of in your attic that I might want. Lots of matchmaker businesses around today, or marketplace businesses, as they're often called. You don't necessarily need money to start those kind of businesses. Right. A third one is subscription models. So you get somebody to subscribe to what it is you want to sell, and they pay you for that subscription in advance. And with that money you have, then you use that to get the business underway. A fourth one is scarcity models. So I don't know if you have a Zara store in Nepal. You may have one in Kathmandu. I'm not sure.
We do. Yeah.
Yeah. And Zara does something that's really ingenious. I worked in the apparel industry at Gap. And Zara is killing Gap, because if you go in Gap today, Gap turns its inventory about 4 times a year. And so you discover that a quarter to a third of the store is in the back, where all the markdowns are, the stuff that didn't sell as fast as they'd hoped. Well, If you go to a Zara store, you don't find any of that, because Zara turns its inventory 12 times a year. And that means the customer has been trained, the Zara customer. If I see something I like, I better buy it today, because tomorrow it's going to be gone.
Right.
The result of turning that inventory really quickly is Zara doesn't need much cash, because the customer pays, when they buy the garment, but Zara doesn't pay the maker of that garment in the supply chain for 60 days. Well, that's 60 days worth of float that they've got, that they can use to build more stores and grow the business. And then the last one is what I call service to product. You take a service business and you figure out what's special about it that could be delivered without the hand holding and the customization, and you turn it into a product, which of course is what Microsoft did when they changed from writing custom operating systems for all the early PC makers And then they said, well, gee, why don't we just write one? We'll call it MS-DOS, and it'll work for all of them. Well, that's when the value in Microsoft really took off, changing that service business into a product business.
And how do you think the landscape of entrepreneurship has evolved since you first began studying it? And what are the key trends shaping it today?
Well, I think there are a lot of trends. I think there's a tendency for both entrepreneurs and investors to be a little bit like lemmings. So when they see another entrepreneur doing X, they say, oh, that looks like a good idea. I want one of those too. So I read the other day that 300, can this be right? Billion? Maybe it's million. $300 million have been invested in AI startups in the last year. Staggering amount of money, right? It seems like every investor has to have a couple of AI deals in their portfolio.
That's right.
Well, that's a trend that's happening today, and we've had similar trends in the past, right? There was hardware, and then there was software, and then there were SaaS models, and on it goes. There are all these trends, but I think aspiring entrepreneurs shouldn't worry too much about what those trends are. I think what they should worry about is finding a compelling problem that some group of customers has, that they have the abilities to solve and the interest in solving. If they can go solve that problem and it's a compelling problem for the customer, they'll have a nice little business. And once they have a nice little business, then they can figure out how to make that little business into a bigger one.
Right. In your book, Getting to Plan B encourages entrepreneurs to embrace failure. Could you share a case study where this approach has led to a success?
Well, I think most entrepreneurs stumble repeatedly, and sometimes failure is a bit too strong a word. But in Silicon Valley, in the investment community there, they like to say that failure is an education on somebody else's nickel. Somebody else invested in that deal, it failed, but hopefully there was some learning that came about from that deal, and now I'm going to back the same entrepreneur, and they've learned some things, and they'll be successful this time around. There's one of the very early case studies I wrote was on a guy who started brewing beer in Colorado. He lived in Breckenridge, a ski resort, and he was brewing beer for his buddies. And everybody said, "Boy, this is really good beer. You should make a business out of this." And he did, and the business began to grow. But he didn't manage working capital very well, and the business almost went under. But they survived that difficult period. Grew the business both with their own locations where they could serve the beer. They had a restaurant in Breckenridge, but also with being one of the early players in the craft brew phenomenon that has swept the brewing industry over the last several years, probably 15 years now. And they ended up getting bought a few years ago by AB InBev, and who would have thought that would have come from a nearly bankrupt business that had almost failed, 15, 20 years earlier. So it happens all the time. But, you brush yourself off and you get up and you find a way to live another day.
Many, entrepreneurs, they sometimes struggle with finding the right business idea. What advice would you give to someone in this position?
There's an investor in California who said something pithy about that question. He said, "Nobody will pay you to solve a non-problem. Find a problem to solve, and somebody will pay you to solve it." I think that's what entrepreneurs should be doing. Often people say, "Well, gee, I want to work for myself, but I don't have an idea." No, you don't need an idea. You need a problem that you can solve. And if you can find a problem, a compelling problem that some group of customers has, and they want to rip your shirt off to get their hands on your solution, then you got the beginning of a nice business. That's what aspiring entrepreneurs should be thinking about.
Right. Very inspiring. The other book, The Customer-Funded Business, discusses the concept of bootstrapping. What are the advantages and limitations of this approach?
Well, one of the wonderful, so bootstrapping has come to mean a lot of things to a lot of people. to some people, it means running a business on very limited resources and finding a way to cut costs. That's on the cost side of the business. My focus in writing the customer-funded business is on the revenue side of the equation, where you get customers to pay you for something before you built it.
Okay.
The advantages, apart from not needing investment capital, are number one, that's validation that you're onto something. If you've got an idea and you can get a customer to pay you to finish the development of that idea, maybe you've got a prototype or something that's kind of half-baked. If you can get somebody to pay you to finish that and bring it to market, boy, that's wonderful validation that you're onto something. Whereas if you
Right.
build it, as many tech people do, in hopes that customers will come, that's a much riskier approach. So it's good validation. It's much lower risk. And by the way, who gets to control the business? The founder does.
Right.
Michael Dell and Steve Jobs both built businesses in the same industry at just about the same point in time, right? Steve
Right.
Jobs built Apple by raising round after round of venture capital, and well done. We'd all like to be Steve Jobs, but of course we know that Steve Jobs got fired, though he did eventually come back. Michael Dell, on the other hand, built that business on pretty much the customer's money. And who's in
Right.
control of Dell Technologies today? Well, it's still Michael Dell all these years later. Who captured the greater share of the value generated? It's Michael Dell, hands down. Now,
Right.
we'd all be happy to be Steve Jobs as well. I'm not knocking that approach, but there's some real merits to getting the customer to fund it.
Right. And what role do you see, technology really playing in the future of entrepreneurship?
Well, technology will also be a key driver, always be a key driver for entrepreneurs because it makes possible new things. Look at all the taxi companies around the world, Uber and Grab and Careem, and there's one in every major city. It was technology that made it possible to basically run a taxi company without owning any taxis, right?
Right.
Without the technology to do that, Uber couldn't have done that. And without Uber, arguably, we wouldn't have a gig economy today. Who knows? Somebody else may have figured out a similar concept. So technology is going to play a key role because it's going to make it possible to do things often at much less cost than we could do them before. I mean, I think sometimes of the first spreadsheet, it was called VisiCalc, written by a guy named Dan Bricklin, and he wrote it for the Apple II. And before VisiCalc, running numbers was an extremely arduous process. You did it on a calculator and big pieces of paper, and if you made a mistake, you had to go erase a bunch of numbers and fix them. Well, now you can do all that at the touch of a keypad. I mean, what an astonishing improvement in productivity because technology made that possible.
Right. And how can, entrepreneurs balance the need for flexibility with the importance of sticking to a strategic plan?
It's a tough question. On the one hand, you have to be tenacious to get through the predictable challenges that are going to block your road. Right. But on the other hand, you have to be willing to say, well, plan A is not working here. Maybe there's a plan B that's going to work better. I don't know that there's a simple answer to your question about how to do that, but I think it's a balance. You have to have both of those things in your mind at all times and think about, well, where am I on that trade-off? Do I need to pivot, or is this thing going to pan out?
Right. And what are some of the common misconceptions that you find about entrepreneurship that you have encountered, and how do you debunk them?
Well, one of them is the myth we've already talked about, that a investor's doorstep is your first port of call when starting a new venture. Clearly that's not the case. I think another one is that there's a a myth that entrepreneurship is a solo sport, that these swashbuckling people do it all by themselves. And that's the furthest thing from the truth. The vast majority of them build good teams around them, complementary teams that bring skills and perspectives and ways of thinking that they themselves lack. It's clearly a team sport, not a solo sport. I think those are the two big ones.
And how can aspiring entrepreneurs identify viable market opportunities?
Well, they should buy my book, The New Business Road Test, and conduct a 7 domains analysis. Gather a bunch of data, talk to a bunch of customers, get some data on how large the market is, look at the industry and ask yourself, is this an industry in which I want to compete? Right. Figure out if you're going to have sustainable competitive advantage and if your business model is going to work over time, and then figure out if you have the right team.
Right.
It's not a trivial task, but if done well, it can vastly improve the odds. We have something at London Business School we call Entrepreneurship Summer School that's mostly for our MBA students who come here for 2 years. And in the summer, if they want to be an entrepreneur, they work on their venture idea, put it through the new business road test, 7 domains process to figure out if they should actually pursue it. And it's not only our students, we have outsiders as well. And there's some interesting data points that have come out of that experience over the last 20 years. One is that 84% of the businesses that were hatched by summer school graduates are still in operation today. That's a staggeringly large number, given the typical numbers. The second interesting data point is that 2/3 of them started a business other than that which they set out to prove was such a wonderful idea in the entrepreneurship summer school. So they got to the end of the summer school and said, well, I'm glad I did this exercise, but I'm sure not going to start that business. I'm going to pivot, I'm going to tweak, or I'm going to do something entirely new.
Right. And what do you think about the mindsets, John? What kind of mindsets that entrepreneurs need to have?
Well, there, as you know, in Break the Rules, I outlined 6 of these counter-conventional mindsets. But I don't argue that all entrepreneurs need to have them. And in fact, when I did the research, I did some quantitative research as well, and asked a large sample of entrepreneurs to what extent they had put these mindsets to work in their careers as entrepreneurs to date. And the mean answer of the number of the mindsets they had used was 3.4. Right. So they don't use all of them all the time. But, when a customer asks them for something that's a little bit outside their comfort zone, they say, yes, we can. When they're thinking about a new product or a new market, they think narrowly. They don't think broadly. They think about some tiny target market that has a compelling problem that only they can solve. They ask for the cash up front, like Michael Dell did, and ride the float and let that cash do all the things they need to start and then ultimately grow the business. They borrow the initial assets they need. When I was in the fresh pasta store business years ago, we didn't build a kitchen, a commercial commissary to make our pasta and sauces at the beginning. We borrowed one at a gourmet food store that was empty in the evenings. We said, can we use that kitchen to make our food? We'll put our pasta machine in there and we'll pay you some rent. Well, that saves us a ton of investment capital at the beginning of the business, and we didn't actually build a commissary of our own until we had proven that there was some customer traction to be had. And then finally, I think entrepreneurs and permission are kind of like oil and water. Entrepreneurs don't like to ask permission for what they want to do. They just get on with it. And while I think we have to be careful not to break laws, often the laws are either in conflict with one another, as they often are in your part of the world. So the founders of TeamLease, a big temporary staffing company in India, set out to put India to work, really, 20 years ago. And their lawyers said, well, if you guys are going to try and comply with all the laws, you're going to have to break 20% of the other laws, because it's a thicket of ill-coordinated laws. Well, they set out to build a business, and they didn't go to jail,
Right.
and they put millions of Indian people to work that otherwise might not have had jobs. So, as long as you're not breaking the law, you shouldn't ask permission. You should just get on with it. And at some point, the regulators, as they did in the taxi industry, might say, "Oh, gee, we don't like this very well. Maybe we're going to have to figure out how to regulate you." But you cross that bridge when you come to it. And meanwhile, you've got very large numbers of consumers who love your product and are going to tell the regulators, "Don't put this company out of business."
Right.
We love them. We need them. So all of those mindsets are going to be very helpful to anybody.
Right. John, final words. Would you agree if I say that, the entrepreneurship is all about solving the larger problem of society?
I would indeed. Large and small problems of society. You don't have to, somebody was asking me today about climate change and if entrepreneurs are going to crack that one. And my answer was, well, I think we don't need entrepreneurs that are going to crack it all in one fell swoop, because I don't think that can be done. What we need is to let 1,000 flowers bloom. And if very large numbers of entrepreneurs are trying to crack little pieces of that very large problem, some of them will make some progress and we'll get there. I think that's how we go forward.
Right. Thanks so much, John. Thank you so much for your time. It was really great talking with you.
Thank you, Sumit. Bye-bye.
Bye.